And it's recording.
Hello, hello. Today is Monday, September 28th, and this is the Release Manager Associates intro and Q&A session. A quick reminder that this meeting is recorded, so please be mindful of code of conduct. And what is the plan for today's meeting? The plan is that Daniel is going to do a quick walkthrough to the Release Manager Associates role, and the plan is to show about what is expected and what are the responsibilities, along with a bit of tips of tricks how you can do the stuff that is needed. So I will hand off it to Daniel.
Awesome. Thanks, Marco. And thanks for getting this all organized and getting the timing down and inviting everyone. I really appreciate that. Just to kind of start off today, I've got like a general plan that we're going to walk through, kind of just as an introduction to some of the responsibilities that release manager associates have. But it's definitely a very flexible agenda. And this is kind of a trial run to see how we can maybe develop some smaller content as well that's a little more digestible. So maybe some condensed things that folks, when they become associates or when they're, cutting their first release or something like that, that they can look these up and consume them. So any questions or ideas you have along the way, obviously feel free to, speak up. You're welcome to interrupt me while I'm talking, and also put those in chat or write them down for ideas for later. But in general, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, which it looks like the host has disabled screen sharing. So I think you're the host now,
I will give you the
Marco. So
permissions. Wait a moment.
cool. Thank you. Um, so anyway, we're going to
Okay.
walk through. Thanks. Looks like that works. We're going to walk through a little bit of the branch manager handbook, which is kind of the canonical place that you go and look for the general overview of the role. One thing I want to point out before we get started, though, is you'll see this notice here that as the patch release team, which used to be separate from the branch manager role, gets condensed into the release manager role, which has been happening over the last cycle and some time a little bit before that. This document is a little bit in flux, and things are changing. So definitely feel free, as it says, to reach out and ask questions, and we'll try and point out some of the places where there's some discrepancies right now. But you're, also welcome to question everything and open PRs to fix things as you find them as well. But in general, a release manager associate and a release manager in general is responsible for, as you would guess, managing releases, right? So that goes from everything to branch management to actually cutting releases to working on the tooling to do all of those things and all the things surrounding it. So typically, at least in my experience, two of the easiest ways to start getting involved, especially as an associate, is to work on the tooling, because that is a static binary that gets compiled. So there's tangible tasks that can be worked on over time, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. And then grow into cutting releases, which is kind of like the primary function, and everything else is in service of that. So quickly, I'm gonna take a outlook that folks are new. Although I know there's a lot of very experienced folks on this call already, so some of this might be kind of elementary for you, but we'll kind of build up to more quote unquote advanced material. One other thing I want to say before I jump too far into it is we have a number of folks on this call who have more experience than me as well. So obviously, please feel free to interrupt and say, actually, let me clarify that, or something like that. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the release repo. So this is in the Kubernetes org. This is the release repo, different from SIG release, which kind of has the information about what release managers do. So the release repo is where we keep all of our tooling. So the important thing to note is that we're currently still in a transition from a bunch of bash scripts, basically, to a Go tool called Krell. And we're kind of in between both in how those interact with each other. So a number of the commands here are based on bash scripts that either still exist or existed in the past. So if you actually look through the Git history here, you'll actually see some of these bash scripts kind of going away as new Krell commands come in. but generally they're pretty straightforward in what they do. So Inago is kind of the core release machinery, and that was kind of the I think the impetus for moving towards a Go based tool, because it is a rather unwieldy script, and you can actually still see it, I believe, here. So you can look through all of the glory that is Inago. And if you're not as versed in Bash as you are in Go, which would be the case for me, this can be a little bit daunting. But as it transitions over to Go, I found it's very easy to kind of implement small little parts of this, as well as implement testing for it, which is something that's rather hard to do with Bash. So you can kind of take a pass through here. It's very well commented, you'll see, and you'll be able to kind of understand some of the steps we go through in releasing. And I'll also show some ways to look at some actual live runs of this, to understand a little bit more what happens. So if you're interested in contributing to Krell, there's obviously lots of issues here that need to be addressed, and Krell ones specifically are prefixed with this Krell in brackets here. So you're obviously more than welcome to help on some of those, especially the ones that say help wanted. So for instance, this one is subcommand to retrieve the build candidate. Um, and it looks like we're still looking for help on this, but it looks like there's some more discussion needed. So obviously take a look at those issues, see if there's anything you'd like to help out with. Working on Krell commands specifically, especially ones related to Inago, are going to help you understand the release process in general, because you're obviously working on the tooling that's actually executed when releases happen. Another thing I want to point out is this release engineering project here, which has a lot of these issues prioritized, which I know Sasha and Tim and Stephen and Laurie have all been working on getting these in here, and Marco as well. So this is also useful to kind of see things that are in to do, things that are 120 priority, and then things that are more backlog. So obviously you can kind of prioritize things you'd like to work on there. But the primary thing that you'll probably start doing as an associate is start to cut releases. So a release is, as you would guess, the publishing of, or the creating and publishing of Kubernetes binaries. And Kubernetes images, etc. So the thing you'd want to look at is release management here. And the first thing to notice is that we have 4 types of releases: alpha, beta, RC, and official. And this kind of walks through in this document what each of these releases looks like and when they're cut. If you want to understand a little bit more about when releases are cut for a specific release, you can always look in the SIG release repo at the releases directory, and we can look at 1.20 here. And you can see actually when we're cutting specific releases here. So you'll see we obviously start with alpha releases, move to beta, and then RC, and then we'd finish up with the official. Official releases are also done for previous branches, for other releases in the past, which we'll get to in a moment. But official releases are basically, ones that have an actual semantic version that is not postfixed with alpha or beta or RC. All right. So, what is the process of actually cutting a release? So, when one of those dates comes up and it's time to cut a release, what do we do? So, the first thing that you do when cutting a release is open an issue. And if you actually go to new issue here, you'll see that cut a release is one of the options. So we can take a look at this without actually creating one right now. So this is a really useful template that pretty much tells you how to cut the release in and of itself. So you obviously have the date when it's scheduled to happen. You have the general steps here. You're going to want to put in the Krell version. So that's basically, which version of the release tool you're using, which helps with if we run into issues down the line. And then we have each of the steps outlined here and the general command for what you'd want to do to run those. One of the things that I found really useful when I was first starting getting into cutting releases and that sort of thing was to look at old issues like this and see what other folks had done and look at the logs and that sort of thing. So if we go back and look at issues here, we can look at some of the closed issues. Specifically, let's look at let's see if we can find an alpha, which I'm guessing my alpha release, this needs to be closed actually. Let's see. Well, I thought this was updated. Well, I have a to-do to go and update this and add more information there. I must have closed out before updating. So one thing to do after you finish a release, make sure to close out the issue. But you can see in general here the steps that are run. So basically, you put in the command that you're running. You put a link to the cloud build logs, which are going to be spit out when you run the command, and put the start and the duration and if it succeeded, etc. So you'll see that what you do usually is you have a stage and a release process. Once again, this is stated in the documentation here, stage and release. And you have a mock first, which is basically a dry run saying, let's make sure everything works as expected. And then you have the actual stage and release. So when you run these with the no mock flag, you're going to be prompted to say, do you want to actually run a release essentially? And you'll say, yes, I'd like to actually do that. And the stage is going to basically publish and create the binaries. The release is going to actually release them. So let's take a look at, for instance, let me move this around so it's out of our way. Oh, it's not letting me move my Zoom thing here. This is very annoying. All right. Well, we'll do this instead. All right. So looking at some of these build logs here, if you scroll through them, you'll kind of see all of the steps that are happening for the various different actions that we take. So, first we're getting all the modules here. And something I find really nice is we actually have these headers here, which if you look through Inago again, you're going to see these kind of specified. But it's generally what you'd think of in a release. You're going to check the prerequisites, set the build candidate, and you can see all the different session values and the different things that happen. And it's pretty well annotated, but there's things like building the cross container. Let's see what else would be interesting to look at here. Building the tree, basically just all the different steps that you go through to create the binaries. Let me scroll down a little bit and see if we can find something a little interesting. So at the end, there's lots of helpful things to tell you what to do next. So for instance, to release the stage build, it's going to give you the command essentially to do that. So that can be really useful for going through releases as well. But in general, this is the workflow you'll get. A couple things that I want to point out that aren't necessarily documented in the branch manager handbook right now is since the vanity domain flip, we do have to promote images to be able to release them. And I believe there is something that mentions it here, the image promotion documentation. So this is some really useful information, and we actually have a Krell tool that will do this for us now, which we used for the last image promotion. I think Adolfo worked on that maybe, so shout out to you for the great work on that. And it will basically create these PRs for you and do the image promotion. So once you stage these images, essentially you need to promote them to the correct channels to be able to release them. And so if we're visualizing what this looks like here, I'm going to try and move this again. It's still not letting me. Sorry about that, folks. This would be in between the stage and release kind of steps here. And let me see if I can, where did I put the example PR? Here we go. So this is an example of image promotion for 1.19 RC3. And you can see this is in the Kates.io repo, which kind of manages all of the infrastructure for Kubernetes. And what happens here is we basically are just
Sorry for
updating the.
interrupting. We can see the PR. We see the 1.20 issue.
Say it one more time.
We can see the PR for the image promotion. We see the handbook right now. If
You see
you,
the handbook?
yeah, we
Interesting.
see the PR now.
Oh, okay, good. So that's right, correct? Everything's working as expected.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So basically, what's happening here is we're updating the checksums for the different versions, which will result in the image promotion when this PR is merged. You do need to watch and actually see that the image promotion happens. So there is a job that runs where you can see that. I want to pull up the most recent one, so you can see. Um, let's see here. The image promotion for Alpha 1. Um, so this one was generated, as you'll see, with Krell. So it'll actually create these for you, and you can go and see, uh, that the images were promoted and that sort of thing. Let me actually show you what that looks like. So this is the image promotion. We haven't had one recently, so you won't see any here. But generally, what you could look at is after you've merged that PR to promote the images, then this will run, and you should be able to see that the images are actually present, which you can use Scopia or something like that to inspect the images and make sure the correct versions are there. And then you're ready to cut a release. Another thing you'll notice is cutting the packages. So this is the debs and RPMs, and those are only necessary for the official releases. So if you actually look at, once again, creating an issue, you will see, let me go to cut a release, that'll actually notify this, right? Not required for pre-releases, but when it is required, you'll have to get a Google Build admin to be around to basically cut those packages for you. So you basically, once you get past the stage, or once you get past the release, sorry, you say, at Google Build admins, please cut the packages for me and let me know when you're ready to do so, and then we follow up after that. I do want to. It looks like we have some things in the chat here, so I don't want to miss anything important. Tim's comment about the hardest bash to understand. All right, cool. It looks like just general things. Thanks for dropping the links in there, Carlos. All right, so that's the general steps for a release. Like I said, looking through old issues can kind of show you the general workflow and some of the logs and what you should expect to see there. Let me jump back to the handbook here. I want to stop before we move on to kind of the next section and see if anyone has any questions at this point before I continue on.
So we decide who we're cutting off in version more or less on the flight, as I've seen it in the release manager channel, right?
Yes. So it kind of depends on the release. Usually, I think this is generally it. Usually, release managers will do official releases, and then there's also some interesting things around the first RC and the alpha. But in general, it's folks who are interested are able to cut one. So we try to kind of pass around their responsibilities, both to share the workload and also to give folks more experience. But yeah, in general, that happens in the release management channel, and there's also an opportunity for folks to kind of shadow someone cutting a release if they'd like to do that first, or if they'd like to someone to kind of like watch over their shoulder essentially while they cut a release. Those are also options, but generally there's a few folks that are around to kind of assist during a release in case if anything comes up. Any other questions about the different types of releases? you know, any of the steps to cutting a release. A lot of the tooling that goes around this, we're kind of spoiled at this point, makes this really easy. But it does kind of like, you know, take an actual human in the loop at this point still. So there is a few, you know, small complexities, and sometimes we'll run into issues that have to be corrected on the fly. But in general, I think the workflow is pretty solid at this point.
I have some questions that go a little bit deeper onto the release process. I don't know if this is the right time or maybe leave it at the end.
Sure, you can go ahead.
So in Enago, I see lots of references to Jenkins, but I don't think it's actually used, or is it at some point used for anything?
I think it depends on the specific reference, but in the actual release process, I don't believe that Jenkins is used. It's all cloud build, but I think there are some components of Inago that make use of Jenkins. I would defer to Sasha if you have any more, Sasha or Carlos, if you have any more insight on that. But I'm fairly certain there's no Jenkins involvement during the actual release process.
Yeah, that build version actually comes out of Jenkins. So
Gotcha.
this somewhere version, and then we append some build ID. And yeah, sometimes we refer to it as build ID or Jenkins build version, but generally we would convert that to build ID.
Yeah, so if you look through some of those issues that we were on.
Actually, I think that was related to my next question. I see usually, especially when artifacts get staged, there is an identifier like this thing I'm putting in the chat. Like it says 9.11 beta, then 0.92 plus, and I think it's a part of a hash or something.
Mm-hmm.
That's the build ID, or where does that come from?
Yeah, that's the build version. So if it's not, you know, like if you're not actually running a release that is, you know, making it like beta.1 or beta.0, basically the whole first part of the simver before that final like .82 in the reference there is the last version essentially. So if you look at, for instance, the alpha 1 release, let's take a look at the build version here. So you'll see I'm running it on basically using the latest build, which is alpha.0, right? So I'm cutting the alpha.1 release. So it's alpha.0, 1624. That's just incremented with the number of builds that happen. So basically with, you know, the number of merges to master. And then the hash is related to the commit hash. So that's basically what that's describing.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions about what we've talked about thus far? All right, cool. So I'm going to continue on, and once again, I'll reiterate. Please feel free to interrupt me or ask any questions at any time. One thing I want to touch on next, you know, we have kind of these like scheduled releases where we do these steps I've described here. But I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of like the philosophy of, you know, when a release gets cut and kind of how that relates to the rest of SIG release and especially the release team for each cycle. So one thing you'll notice on every issue for a new release that's cut is the snapshot of the test grid dashboards. Which should be in the steps up here. Yep, screenshot unhealthy release branch test grid boards. So this is actually an automated tool here that will get these screenshots for you and spit out basically the exact content you need to post into the comment. So it's really, really nice tooling. Excuse me. And this is actually a tool in Krell or in the release tooling. So you can just run test grid snapshot and it will show you how to do that. But, you know, if you've been to a release meeting, you obviously know that we have CI signal updates and, you know, like bug triage updates and that sort of thing. And how do those inform how we're actually releasing? Why are we even doing that, right? So we have our dashboards on test grid, which are basically running all of these tests and jobs that are telling us the health of the current release and previous release versions, right? So we don't want to release something that we know to be, bad code or a bad binary. So we want to make sure that there's nothing failing on SIG release master blocking if we're doing an alpha, beta, or RC release. And then if we're doing an official release, then we'd be looking at the actual branch for that, right? So we have the previous 3 versions here. And so when you run test grid snapshot, you want to make sure that there's nothing failing on those branches. And you'll see here that we have like a number of flaking things here. And you kind of have to use context to understand whether it's okay to move forward with a release or not. So there's been times in the past, especially with like alpha and beta releases, where we've even had a failing job on master, but where, we communicated with CI signal or some of the different SIGs and understood exactly what that meant and felt comfortable moving ahead with that. Obviously, as we move towards an official release at the end of a cycle, it's very troubling if we have, a failing job or something like that. So understanding the health of the release informs whether we move forward with it. And if you ever have any questions around that, because even no matter how experienced you are, if you don't have the context around why something is flaking or failing, it may be important to reach out to CI Signal, for instance, and say, hey, I noticed that we have a failing job on master blocking. Are we okay to move forward with the release? Like, what's the context around that? And you can also obviously ping release managers as well. But like I said, that's more relevant for official releases when we're saying, this is a known good release that we're putting out there. We shouldn't have any failing jobs in those situations. All right, so I wanted to move. We have about 15 minutes left, and I think that what we've talked about so far, at least in my experience, were the primary things that I worked on as an associate. But as you move into a release manager role, branch management in general becomes important, right? So if you aren't familiar with kind of like the Kubernetes strategy of releases and branches and that sort of thing, every major release, or I guess minor release in this case, has its own branch, right? So you'll see release for every dot, minor here. So for instance, 1.19 is our most recent release, and then master is obviously the most recent commits are going into that. And during the release cycle for a current release, we will cut a branch and keep it up to date, right? So if you've ever seen those messages in Slack that are like branch fast forward complete, probably from Carlos over the 1.19 release, he was in charge of doing that. Basically what that's saying is when we cut the release branch during a release cycle, we are going to continue to keep that up to date with master until we actually cut the official release there. So 1.19.0 in that case. So essentially every time something's merged to master, we want to, fast forward with that and keep those in sync until the release happens. Now, after a release happens, obviously old versions don't pick up everything that's in a new version. So if you want something to be, included in an old version, then you're going to have to cherry pick that back, right? So we merge it to master and then cherry pick it onto an older branch. And that's essentially how new content gets in for patch versions of old releases. So another part of the release manager's role is to manage cherry picks. So I'm going to see here if we have any explicit cherry picks here. I saw some tagging on some, but we can look at the cherry pick labels here and just pull some out. All right, so we don't want cherry pick approved, but I'll go ahead and take a look at it anyway. So you'll see that there's none open with cherry pick approved because generally cherry pick approve is the last thing that happens, but we can go ahead and we can look at 1.19 update. So this is from Steven. So this is a good one to look at here. All right. So this was after the 1.19 release happens. And so updating to a new Go version, particularly if it, includes some security vulnerability fixes or something like that, could be something that's a candidate for backporting. So after 1.19.0 came out, there were updates to master to update to go 1.15.2. And you'll see this is the original PR to do that update. And this one may not be the best example because I don't think this is actually generated with the cherry pick tooling, but it still kind of illustrates. So essentially what happens with any sort of cherry pick to an old branch, it goes through its normal review by SIGs, right? So typically the people who reviewed the first PR that went into master are going to also be tagged for review on something that is going to be merged into an older branch. And so our role really doesn't come in unless if you're involved with the SIG or the changes that are being made until after a PR that's a cherry pick already has approve and looks good to me on there. So essentially what they're saying is, all right, we have, as domain experts here have said, this is something that is valid to go in. This is good code. I reviewed it. I'm an approver for this owner's file. And now they'll tag the release managers on it. So let's see if Steven, this might have had release manager tagged from the beginning. Yeah, so this isn't a great example, but let me go back and see this one here. If you see it with automated cherry pick, let me go back one more time. Automated cherry pick, this format generally indicates that it was actually created by the release tooling. So this is a kubectl bug. And you'll see that Eddie opened this and assigned Sean, which he is an owner for this code. So he added the looks good to me and approved. And then Eddie gave the Kubernetes release manager tag here. And essentially what we do is come through here, and Tim actually approved this one. And if you're knowledgeable of, what this change is here, then you go and you can actually review the code and say, okay, this makes sense as something to be cherry picked to a previous release branch. But generally, if a someone who's a domain expert, an approver in that SIG has approved it, then it's something that is a candidate for going in. So really our job is to say, is this something that should be cherry picked, right? And if it is, all you do to actually allow this to be merged is go into the labels, and you'll see it's already here. And if you put the cherry pick approved label, it's going to remove this do not merge cherry pick not approved. And essentially, Tide is going to say, okay, now it's ready to go in. So generally for a PR, you have to have approved and looks good to me. If it's a cherry pick to an older branch, you have to have approved, looks good to me, and cherry pick approved, which only release managers have the ability to do. So it's important, right, to take regular kind of passes through cherry picks that are open, because folks are reliant on us for those to be merged. And that's something we've been talking about recently, because there is some sort of, disorganization sort of with merging cherry picks, because they are just kind of PRs that get release managers tagged on them. So, who's in charge of doing that can be kind of fuzzy. But recently we've talked about, having like periodic scrubs, like a Zoom call where we go through and maybe discuss some of the things, because there's sometimes opportunities where a cherry pick may, it may be hazy whether it should be included or not. But that is the general process for it. That's how cherry picks work. If something is cherry picked back to an old release branch, then in the next patch version, it will be included in the release, obviously. All right. Does anyone have any questions on the cherry pick process or kind of the release manager's role in that before we continue on?
Just to have a small comment, like when they have like a cherry pick for example, for 119, we check if the same cherry pick exists for the older branches, in this case 118 and 117. And if they have, like for example, in the past 3 releases, we only apply the label if both cherry picks have the looks good to me and approve, because then we want to merge in the all 3 branches at the same time to have the same fix across all the branches. If, for example, 116 or 117, there is no approve or looks good to me, we try to talk to the approvers from the other cherry picks and ask them to review that one before merging the orders as well. So all the cherry picks are good, then we merge, in this case, in these 3 release branches as well.
That's a great point, Carlos. Thanks for bringing that up. And one thing I'd add to that is, not everything is going to be cherry picked to every active branch, right? So branches, rotate
Yeah.
out of support. But just because something in support obviously doesn't mean it's going to receive a cherry pick. So a great example of that is a new feature being added in 1.19, and then a bug is discovered in it, and then we cherry pick back to 1.19. Obviously, that feature doesn't exist in earlier branches, so there will be no cherry pick there. But if it does, Carlos is exactly right. You don't want to have approval to go to one branch and not others, because that could cause some conflicts. All right. Any other questions on the cherry pick process? All right. So we have about 5 minutes here left. So I want to quickly touch on branch management. Once again, this is something that moves more towards the release manager rather than release manager associate role. But obviously, this is something that you want to learn about as an associate so you can eventually take on these responsibilities as well. So I definitely want to touch on it. And to be totally transparent, Carlos and Sasha and some others have run a lot more of this more than I have, but I have general familiarity with it, and have reviewed things related to it. It's also related to some of the SIG release roles on the release team, so it's relevant in that regard as well. So obviously things you need to do, we talked about branch fast forwarding. To be able to branch fast forward, you need to be able to create a branch. So here's some information about branch creation. Important thing to note here is we changed last release when the actual coming release branch gets created, which obviously affects how things are fast forwarded and that sort of thing. But you can imagine cutting it too early is kind of just extra work for no reason, because if you're fast forwarding to keep up, then you're basically matching master exactly. So if you have more questions about that, feel free to reach out with those. Other things that need to happen, which I'm particularly familiar with, the test infra configuration. So we looked earlier, at the master blocking branches. Once we have a new release branch, we want to start having jobs that run specifically on that, right? So for a while, or for the last third or so of a release cycle, you should see that the most recent branch boards are going to match that of master blocking in terms of if something's failing on master blocking, we'd assume it's also failing on the coming release branch as well. Once again, because that's being fast forwarded, right? So it's testing the same code. But in order to actually create these branches and these new dashboards, you have to go into test infra, which I assume most folks are pretty familiar with, but basically this is where all our configuration for different jobs that run go, and also how they're reflected on test grid dashboards. So it always takes me some time to find exactly where these are, but jobs, I think it's Kubernetes and SIG release. So release branch jobs, this is primarily what you're going to look at. And if we actually see these, so these are the different branches that are in support right now. And so you'll see that essentially they're just the different job flavors for these different branches. And I want to note how these actually get generated. So I'm going to see if I can find a recent PR. So there's been a few things that have happened here since these branches were actually created. A lot of these that you'll see from Kate's CI robot is just updating the Kubekins image, which happens automatically. You can see me messing around with some stuff, but I'm trying to find, and I probably should just look in the actual, yeah, I'll look for the PR. But essentially what you do is you run the release branch generation to be able to cut these new or generate these new types, right, and cycle in, right? Because once we add a new dashboard for a new release version, then we're going to drop off an old one that's no longer in service. So let's see if we can just find a PR Okay, these are actually all going to be from that. Okay, so I can point you to a PR later on about which actually updates these, but essentially these are generated for each of the different branch jobs. And I believe, which I should have that's earlier, rel-eng, so config forker and config rotator are kind of the things responsible for this. So you'll see that some of the job configurations here are going to have fork per release in them. So yeah, fork per release true. So if you look through all the different job configurations in test infra, if it has the fork per release annotation, that basically means that we want to generate a different flavor of this job for each release branch, right? And run it against those. And we have tooling, obviously config forker to do that. And so that'll basically spit out those files, those YAML files we were looking at earlier, which have the generated jobs for each release branch that are also on master blocking. So that's kind of how we get those, and that's how we, see what our signal is on old branches, which then inform, when we cut releases, as I mentioned earlier. All right, trying to see if there's anything else that we could cover here in the last minute or so. Variants are important. So you saw those different Kubekins image bumps in test infra as well. So if you look at the variants that we have here, basically we need to keep up variants for each release branch. So that's saying, have the code for this release branch basically in this Kubekins image that we use to run our jobs. So updating those to be consistent with each of these is important. One other thing I want to touch on, which isn't actually, I don't think, in the release manager handbook, is version markers. So if you see something like stable, so this says stable.1.18, but you'll see things like stable 1, stable 2, or latest. Basically, that's saying, it's corresponding to the release branch. So it's an agnostic way to talk about, X releases back of Kubernetes. So you'll see in some jobs that it uses, like XX stable 1, et cetera, which is basically saying, this stable 1 version of Kubernetes. So if you see those version markers, those basically get updated by some of the build jobs here. So let's actually see if we can find one real quick. And I see that we're actually at time, but I wanted to mention this real quick because I think it's something that is sometimes opaque to folks. Well, actually, we can look at something like conformance GCE. And see if we can find this real quick. So basically, the version markers tell you which version to download for different release jobs. So this is part of the K8s extract or extract K8s script that's in test infra, or it's not script, it's Go code. But essentially here you can see that we're getting the latest version. So these different jobs, they pull based on kind of which version it is, which means you don't have to update them, right? Each time we cut a new release, you can just say get stable 1. Then it will look for the version marker for stable 1, which, could be something like 1.19.3 RC0. And those get automatically updated. So we're basically changing what the URL gives you back when you curl for it, rather than, updating the job to point at a specific one each time, which means that we can use the latest Kubernetes code or the latest, stable 1 code or latest of the coming release or something like that in the different jobs. If you have more questions about that, that was kind of a haphazard way to explain it. So please feel free to reach out. So hopefully this was kind of a fire hose of information here. And I presented it in that way so that we can kind of say, okay, those things stuck, those things didn't. We need more clarity on them. So I would definitely really appreciate it, and I'm sure others would as well, if you have questions that came out of this call. If you could, let me know or let Marco know, or just post them in release management, so that we can kind of create smaller condensed videos or even just, write-ups about how different things work, so that they can be more consumable for new folks and more consumable for folks like yourselves. But before I sign off, definitely want to see if there's any questions I can answer here. Obviously, anyone feel free to drop off if you have other things to get to.
Yeah, I've got a quick question and have some time to stick around. So I definitely have been involved with the Release Manager Associates for quite some time now. I kind of took a step back for a job transition, and then now I'm trying to get back more involved and engaged. And I see all these different areas, but like, where am I most effective? Do I just go into the backlog? Is it in Slack? Do I shadow people on, cutting branches? I guess I struggle to find like an action item for me to pick up and start to run with.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jim. I'd say like one of the things that's been really helpful for me, and kind of how I think I, accelerated pretty fast through understanding some of the stuff is just monitoring a bunch of PRs, and seeing, oh, okay, like why are we bumping this image here? Why are we, changing how this command works? So obviously the release repo is relevant for that. Release managers get tagged on image bumps and different things. So, just setting up notifications for that can be really useful. Things that I've found are useful, especially when I'm time constrained, is taking on some responsibility of a issue on the release repo for Krell or something like that, because those are less time sensitive, right? They're not like scheduled for a release or something like that. So those can be a good way to be involved, when you are time constrained. And then the other thing, just like you mentioned, just reaching out to folks and being like, hey, why are you doing this? No one's gonna be upset about you like questioning it. And there's definitely been times where someone is like, hey, why are you doing this? And I'm like, I have no idea, like this is just what we do. And that's obviously not a good way to ever be approaching any steps we're taking, especially around the release. So please feel free to just question people. And me or others will be very, happy to get those questions. A great example of that is that release manager kind of document that we went through, that content notice about things being out of date. Actually, I just updated something, Jim. I saw you have made a big update through that a few months ago. So like stuff like that, obviously super helpful. It's clear you had gone through and seen some of the inconsistencies there. So yeah, hopefully those are some kind of action items.
Cool. Yeah, definitely appreciate it.
For sure. Any other questions from folks?
Yeah, for me, I'm kind of on the other side of the release of the SIG release activities. I would like to get more familiarized with the testing side of it. So I've never been a part of the CI signal team or been near to it. So I'd like to get more familiar with that. So what would you suggest?
Yeah, so that's probably the direction that I most came into SIG release from. So I'm certainly passionate about that. One of the things that would be really useful there, and one of the things that helped me actually understand what was happening in all these releases, was seeing when jobs were failing. So when you see like an issue open, it's like failing test or something like that. Investigating those and looking through the logs are going to tell you a lot about how the releases work. So every job is either pulling in a release or creating a release or creating a build or something like that. So everything kind of touches the release process, right? We need to inform jobs where to get the latest code, or we need to, actually be producing that code. So when we looked at test infra, there's the build jobs there, which will show, how we build things and push new versions and where they go, what bucket they live in, that sort of thing. And then other jobs like the one I was just showing before I stopped sharing my screen, is pulling in a specific release version. So, looking at that and then finding out where that code came from and then actually troubleshooting the test that's failing. Those are great ways to understand how different testing works. And something that I did as part of CI Signal, which this may not be something that, folks want to do who aren't in that work already. But writing like a short paragraph about what a job does, the steps, like, oh, it goes and pulls this release down and then it runs these tests with these annotations on them and that sort of thing. That really helped me, understand like how everything was working together exactly. And so if that's something you're interested in, number one, I'd say it's a great like personal exercise. And number two, CI Signal folks really appreciate that as well. And so, any documentation there, especially, is I'm sure really useful. And I think we're a little light on kind of like the documentation around testing in the release manager handbook. So I'm sure there'd be an opportunity to add some documentation there.
Yeah. So when we get those emails, letting someone, I guess us, know that some of the tests in CA and SIG release are failing, that's our responsibility, or?
So actually like fixing them is not really our responsibility, I guess. You know, it kind of goes, CI Signal is responsible for responding to those emails and going and seeing what's wrong and making sure someone addresses them. And the person who addresses them is usually someone in a SIG. As a release manager, sometimes the failure is our responsibility. So like if we're not publishing builds or something like that, that'd be something that I'd say falls under SIG release. But even if it's not like your explicit responsibility as a release manager or release manager associate, obviously jumping in there is a great way to just understand more. So, I mean, you can assign any issue to yourself right on Kubernetes and try and fix a bug. And that probably, you know, will touch release in some way.
All right, thank you.
Mhm.
Do we have any other question?
One thing I want to mention here, it's in the chat from Max, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Sasha and I gave 2 talks this summer/fall, I guess. One at KubeCon China and one for KubeCon EU that kind of touch on both the SIG release in general and the different roles in it. And then Sasha especially led a talk on release engineering. I think that was the second one. We recorded them, I think, out of order, in which case they were actually broadcast. So I don't remember exactly, but one of them is more focused on release engineering and one's more focused on the release team in general. So if you want to take a look at those are great resources. Thanks for bringing that up, Max. Cool. Well, if there's not too many other questions, I'm gonna let Marco kind of sign us off here. But I really would love to hear specific things that you'd like to see examples of. There are some YouTube videos actually of going through an actual release, so you can actually watch. I know specifically right when I became an associate, I watched Sasha do one. I believe there's a YouTube video of that, which some of that may be out of date, but it gives you a general idea. But if you'd actually literally like curated videos or curated walkthroughs or that sort of thing, that'd definitely be something I'd be interested in working on. I know Marco is really leading the charge in that, so I appreciate that, Marco. So please feel free to give any of us feedback on things that we can do to make the onboarding process better.
Okay, so we are coming to the end. I would first like to thanks a lot to Daniel for stepping up to do this session because it was great and I hope that all of you liked it. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. If you have any other questions or any other feedback, or is there anything you'd like to see from us, please let us know in Release Manager's channel, or feel free to ping me in direct messages if you prefer that way. As soon as the recording of this meeting is available, I will make sure to post it on Release Manager's channel as well as on the mailing list, so you can catch up if you missed anything or if you just want to go through some parts again. And thank you for joining. That's it for today.
Awesome. Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Too much.